If you would have asked me 5 years ago what the on-trend brewing thing would be in 2021, I never would have guessed that hard seltzer water would be so popular. Laugh all you want, but hard seltzer is a fantastic day drinker and likely isn't going anywhere in the near future. Imperial Yeast's new seasonal strain, W04 Paramount, can help brewers get the most out of their seltzer fermentations. A clean and aggressive fermenter, Paramount will produce an excellent seltzer with low fusel alcohols, and it's produced in a gluten-free medium. If you've tried making seltzer with standard ale or lager strains, you know the struggle, and Imperial Yeast is here to help with W04 Paramount. Check it out at imperialyeast.com. Welcome to the Brew Lab. Over the past several weeks, we've been spending a lot of time talking about yeast, be it genetically modified or harvested from the wild, but there are other organisms that you can harvest, including one of my favorites, lactobacillus, which is of course used to produce sour beers, a favorite style of mine, your host Cade Job, and my co-host Jordan Folks. Jordan, welcome back to the lab.
Athena by Creature Comforts is maybe the best kettle sour I've ever had in my life. It is truly an incredible American example of Berliner Weisse.
Oh man, it's really, really good. So Daniel actually sent me some samples of it. I didn't get to try those before the show, but he sent me some samples, and it is actually incredible. It's hot here in Oregon today. It's around 96. So I'm definitely planning on having one of these this afternoon once we're done recording. But yeah, I love a good sour, and it was really cool to hear about Creature Comforts process, don't you think?
Yeah, it's pretty fascinating. I can't believe that they're pulling these this level of speed when it comes to kettle souring.
I know, that's just totally nuts. And of course, that's something we're going to jump into today. So last week I talked with, of course, Daniel LePage, who's the director of quality of Creature Comforts Brewing Company in Athens, Georgia, maker of Athena, as well as Paradiso and a couple of other versions of Berliner Weisse. So I talked to him last week about the unique aspects of their kettle souring process. And there was a ton of information in that episode and a huge amount of practical advice, including the fact that they're making sours in about 2.5 to 4 hours. That's just totally unheard of, in my opinion. So that's something I'm excited to talk to you about, Jordan, today. And if you are struggling to brew kettle sours, take a listen to that episode. There are several tips and tricks that Daniel shared, and also a few that Jordan and I are going to share of our own today. But first, if you're not already a patron of Brewlosophy, please consider becoming one. We really appreciate all the support that our patrons give us, and as a reward for your support, you do get awesome rewards, like access to unpublished contributor recipes, discounts at YakimaValleyHops.com, and an invite to a monthly live Q&A session. And becoming a patron is easy. There's no obligation. You can cancel it at any time. And if you're out there listening to this show and all of the other stuff that we're doing here at Brewlosophy and Brewlosophy.com, please consider joining us or supporting us by becoming a patron. And this month's Q&A guest is Jamil Zainasheff, author of Brewing Classic Styles and co-author of the Water Brewing Elements series by the Brewers Association. He's host of Brew Strong and other shows on the Brewing Network, and founder and former owner of Heretic Brewing in California. Jamil is truly a homebrew legend, and he's got commercial brewing experience. He's brewed through all of the BJCP styles and made gold medal winning beers in each of those styles, which is a feat I don't know that very many people have accomplished. Jamil's a great guest, and he's just a wealth of information, so you don't want to miss out on that episode this month. You can find more information or on that Q&A session this month. You can find more information on how to become a patron at patreon.com/brewlosophy. And you can always support us by using the links at brewlosophy.com/support. Just start your shopping experience by clicking the links, and we get a small kickback. Every little bit helps, and it doesn't change your shopping experience at all. And you can find all of our affiliate links at brewlosophy.com/support. Feedback this week is brought to you by the dedicated crew at Haas, who bred Sabro from a Neo-Mexicanus subspecies growing wild in the mountains of New Mexico. Think you know Sabro? Think again. This monster of a hop is efficient when it comes to delivering big flavor. Use less green to save more green, if you know what I mean. If you like pina coladas and getting caught in the rain, try it in the Whirlpool. It's full of aroma and chemical compounds that last from the hop side to the final glass, even if you dry hop on top of it. Sabro's known for its incredible blend of coconut, hazelnut, tropical, and stone fruit, with a pronounced cream character with flavors of vanilla, cedar, dill, and even mint. Can't decide where to use it? No sweat. Sabro's available in all Haas hop formats to meet your brewing needs, including highly consistent Lupamax to efficient Incognito and traditional T90 pellets. Learn more about this awesome variety as well as the other innovative products Haas has to offer at johnihaas.com. That's John, the letter I, Haas.com. All right, we're continuing with feedback from listener Brian, author of the Sui Generis blog, and he wrote in with some questions or with some feedback from our last Applying the Science episode about harvesting yeast from the wild and foraging. He says, midway through, you discussed Lachantia thermotolerans. While this yeast does make lactic acid, it does not do so via aerobic fermentation. Rather, the lactic acid is a product of anaerobic fermentation. Whether lactic acid or ethanol are being made, what happens is the yeast break down sugars into pyruvate in a process called glycolysis. And in this process, they extract energy via fermentation. Once pyruvate is made, the yeast have a problem as glycolysis releases a few extra electrons that the yeast then need to get rid of. To make lactic acid, an enzyme called lactate dehydrogenase transfers this electron and a hydrogen ion back to pyruvate, which converts the pyruvate into lactic acid. In ethanol fermentation, an enzyme called pyruvate decarboxylase removes the carbon dioxide from pyruvate to make acetaldehyde, and then a second enzyme called alcohol dehydrogenase then transfers an electron and hydrogen into acetaldehyde to make ethanol. All right, hopefully y'all are still with me here because these are essentially the pathways of fermentation. And here's the nut. He said both pathways are fermentation pathways as neither requires oxygen. What causes the shift from lactic acid fermentation to ethanol fermentation is nutrient availability. Lachantia produce lactic acid when they have access to simple sugars like glucose. Once glucose is depleted, the lactate dehydrogenase gene is turned off and the genes to make ethanol get turned on. This process is called glucose repression and is pretty common in yeast. It's why Saccharomyces will ferment wort into ethanol even if oxygen is present, for one example. Brewers can take advantage of this when brewing with Lachantia by using low mash temperature or the addition of glucose, corn sugar to increase the amount of simple sugars available, which in turn will increase lactic acid production. What do you think, Jordan?
What an incredible description of the process there, and really good tips for using the Lachantia yeast for, dialing in these various flavor profiles we're trying to get with this approach. So I'm curious, does that mean that simple Saccharomyces is producing lactic acid as well? Because we do see a pH drop over the course of a standard sac fermentation.
That's a really good question. I think that has more to do with regulating the internal of the yeast. I think that in regulating the internal pH of the yeast. So some of the ways that yeast get nutrients into his body is through proton export and import. So I think that has more to do with those things. But it is possible maybe they are producing a little bit of lactic acid. I mean, there's all kinds of organic acids that are produced by yeast that are used by the yeast, and so that's probably causing the drop. And I would guess that lactic acid is definitely one of those. So I do think that the yeast is producing lactic acid. But this is really interesting. So yeah, this is part of especially with Lachantia thermotolerance. If there's glucose, so simple sugars present, like not maltose, that yeast would use and break down into glucose, but glucose present, they actually just use that and prefer using that in lactic acid fermentations. I thought it was really cool and a really great way to put that. So thanks, Brian, for doing that. And also, I'd encourage listeners to rewind and play back this specific feedback episode, this feedback comment, because that was a lot, but it's all really good and really practical information. Like, for example, if you want to increase the sour of Lachantia, one of the ways to do it is to add glucose or corn sugar right at the beginning of fermentation. So that might help you get more sourness out of Philly Sour if you're looking for it to do a little more. Thanks, Brian, for sending that in and for nerding out with us. So listeners, see if you can apply some of that knowledge also to today's episode about kettle souring, which we'll be back to talk about right after this break.
One of the biggest improvements to my brewing practices was the upgrade to stainless steel, and Delta Brewing Systems offers some of the lowest prices on high-quality stainless gear, like the Firm Tank, which holds 8 gallons or 30 liters of wort, comes with a domed lid to reduce the chances of a messy blow-off, and it can hold up to 4 psi of pressure. Delta Brewing Systems also has their own line of brew kettles, as well as one of the lowest priced all-in-one electric brew systems out there, and their prices are remarkably affordable. If you're in the market for legit stainless gear that won't break the bank, you've got to check out deltabrewingsystems.com. We all know that designing recipes is really fun, and doing it well is so much easier with good software. We at Brewlosophy recently made the switch to Brewfather, and honestly, y'all, we could not be happier. Brewfather utilizes the latest technology to bring you the most robust cloud-based recipe design software that can be accessed anywhere, on your phone, tablet, desktop, and even offline. It also works seamlessly with numerous third-party devices to make it easier to monitor every step of your brew. I know change can be difficult, but trust me when I say you need to go to brewfather.app today to try it out for yourself. That's brewfather.app.
There are many different ways to make sour beers, from kettle souring to spontaneous open fermentation to pitching inoculated cultures to barrel aging, and each method comes with its own costs and benefits. So I thought it would be cool to start with a discussion. Jordan, what's your favorite method for souring beer and why?
Oh man, good question. I think that my favorite method for home production would be a pitching lab cultures. It's so easy. I think that Belgian Lambic is a beautiful product, and you can do spontaneous beers at home, but there's some risk involved there. I did a true spontaneous ferment attempt, didn't pitch anything one time. It didn't even ferment. And so with the what I think Mike Tomsmeyer liked to say that pitching lab cultures is like making sour beer with a resume. This stuff from Bootleg Biology and Imperial, etc., it works, and it's really easy, and it makes really complex, beautiful sour beer. And I mean, I've never had to dump a batch when using a lab culture, but it takes time. And blending is really going to be your friend when dialing in that perfect kind of balance. And so it's definitely not as easy as a kettle sour. And so I think that's one of the reasons that those are so attractive, is how quick and, on the production level, affordable they are to make. And then also not risking any sort of contamination in the brew house.
Yeah. So are you saying pitch those lab cultures after hot side, like pitch them after the primary ethanol fermentation?
I do not do a staggered pitch because I've found that it's not necessary, but there's nothing wrong with that. Instead, I just pitch everything. So some sort of boutique lab cultures and also some sack as well, maybe, just to ensure that we get a healthy primary fermentation. And then it's just done, and it's sealed, and I don't have to worry about oxidation. I can come back 6 months, a year later, and then I have a perfectly soured batch of beer.
Nice. Yeah. That's a really good and really easy method, right? I mean, it doesn't really take a lot of effort. Like you just have to have a separate fermenter that you're willing to ferment that stuff in, or watch your sanitation and cleaning processes if you're fermenting beer later in that fermenter. But that's a really good idea, right? Just throw it in, at fermentation once you've made your wort. I think kettle souring is more fun for me too. Although I will say, the reason why I like kettle souring is because I prefer just that straight lactic sourness. I'm not usually looking for something like a lambic or something that's spontaneous that's got something else in it, like Brett or Pediococcus or something. I think a lot of people are looking for those, and that's why a lot of people pitch mixed cultures, right? Either as a secondary fermentation or along with Saccharomyces in the primary fermentation. But for me, really, I'm looking for that sourness, just that little bit of tartness that like lightens it up. And Athena is a great example of what I'm talking about there. It's just, they actually describe it as a refreshing tart ale, right, on the can. I think that's a really, really tough balance to make, is just to have this like nice, refreshing, slightly tart. I always try to describe it as like squirting a little bit of lemon on a piece of fish, and how it just brightens up the whole piece of fish. And you didn't even, the fish is great without the lemon, but you sprinkle that little bit of lemon on there, and it's just like boom, pop, and it tastes amazing. You know what I mean?
Yeah, a well-made kettle sour, and Athena is like the hallmark example for me, is really refreshing. And you could, chug it, on the beach or something like that. You're not chugging Cantillon Goose. You're sipping that. I mean, it would burn your throat on the way down, and it's a different type of enjoyment factor. And I tend to prefer traditional barrel-aged style sour for the complexity, but it's not something that you're going to session or crush, right? And so there's a time and a place for every beer, and a well-made kettle sour is a really nice, lawnmower beer, effectively. Now, it can be done with traditional inoculation, with co-pitching, etc. I made a traditional Berliner Weisse using lacto and Saccharomyces, and it was a while ago, and I can't remember if I used Brett or not. Made it super effervescent, like 4+ volumes of carb in thick, brown bottles, and got some like Woodruff syrup and raspberry syrup, and was doing like in glass different variants. It can be really refreshing. It is possible to make a really refreshing beer with this kind of co-pitch fermentation approach, but you really got to dial the acidity back. It can't be too intense. And I think also something about that lower ABV just makes it a little bit more sessionable.
Oh yeah, true. That's true. Like, yeah, most Berliner Weisses are in that like 3.5 to low 4 range. Just like really sessionable, really crushable. And the syrups too. That's something that I didn't talk about with Daniel, but I love that. Like the Woodruff syrup. I had one of these at St. Arnold's in Houston a long time ago. Probably like 8 or 10 years ago. But I still remember how fun that was to like squirt the syrup into the glass and then pour the beer on top of it, and how interesting that beer was. That was actually before I liked sour beer, so I think I kind of turned my nose up at it. But going back now, I wish I had spent a little more time with it. But you're totally right? You can make a just sour beer by just pitching those lab cultures. Although a lot of people are generally, whenever they're doing secondary pitches, aren't usually just pitching the lab cultures. They're usually pitching something else, like Brett or a Pediococcus, or they're storing it in something like a barrel, right? That's got some flora or microflora already in it from the last batch, and that's what they're doing to make, these nice, complex, flavorful, effervescent beers. And then you have totally different, like Cantillon, right? Which is spontaneous, totally spontaneous. Have you ever been to Cantillon? Or I've never actually been to Belgium.
I'm very grateful that I was lucky enough to go a few years ago. It is truly the pinnacle of a brewer's bucket list visit. You can do your own little tour. You walk in the door and Jean Van Roy or his family is like, welcome. Like, it's so
wow.
Such an incredible experience, and seeing the cool ship, and this equipment is like ancient that they're using. And like, I was like, walking around the attic and started like looking at the hops, so like, hey, get out of there. Like, it was a really cool experience. Highly recommend, if you ever get a chance to go to Brussels, Belgium, you got to go to Cantillon.
Yeah, I mean, it's so cool. I've seen all these pictures of this old ancient wood building. I mean, there's even like photos of the cobwebs that are hanging up in the ceiling above the fermenter. And of course, so spontaneous fermentation is something like where you're rolling your wort out, which has been boiled. It's got maybe some light hopping in it. You're rolling it out into a cool ship, which is basically a just shallow open vessel, maybe not even 4 inches tall, right? It might be 6 inches or 8 inches tall, but it is not a tall vessel, and it's just wide. There's a huge surface area, so whatever is in the air, yeast, bacteria, mold, whatever, is going to get into that beer and just start the fermentation process. Now the yeast is going to take over pretty quick and kill off anything that would be harmful, because it's going to lower the pH, and also add a whole bunch of alcohol that's going to kill most things, and certainly anything that's pathogenic in your beer. But it's really cool to do this, and seeing a spontaneous fermentation is really fun too, because you get to see all the like kind of bubbles start overnight, and like the start of the Krausen formation, and some of it looks yucky and gross. I saw one a while back, a few years ago. I won't name the brewery because it's kind of gross, but there was just like all kinds of bugs in it. And I mean like actual bugs. I don't mean like, the metaphor for, mixed culture pitches. I mean like actual bugs in the fermenter that had just fallen out or crawling in overnight. Of course, they scooped those out and, didn't serve any bug parts with the beer, so don't worry about that. But it is pretty cool to think about. But today's episode, the focus is looking at kettle souring, and this has become super popular over the last few years. Myself especially, it's pretty much the only way that I make sours now. I'm not patient enough to wait for a lactic acid fermentation, 6 months or a year. I do not have the patience that you do, Jordan, to wait 6 months for a sour beer. And again, all I'm looking for is just that little bit of acidity. And so a lot of people would say, well, Cade, just add lactic acid then. And why even screw with it? But I think there's something else that you get. Like lactic acid is very pure. It's a very simple chemical. And I feel like I can taste lactic acid when you use just straight lactic acid. There's this like brown sugary note that sort of comes through. But when you do an actual fermentation with like lactobacillus, it doesn't have that. It just feels like more natural, more rounded. And I like that in a kettle sour. Do you know what I'm talking about when I'm talking about this brown sugar lactic acid smell?
Yeah, I do. But I also think that the feedback that we just read in the prior segment is a really good illustration of there's more that's going on in a lactic acid acidification process in your wort, right? It's not simply you add the lactic acid and it's instantly at your pH. There's chemical processes happening there. Then the pathways that they go through are making a beverage that's going to be arguably more enjoyable. I don't think you're seeing a lot of cheater sours, if you will, where they're simply dumping in a bucket of lactic acid, winning Great American Beer Fest in the Lambic category or anything like that, right? And so I think that the industry has largely decided that if you want a world-class sour beer, you need the chemistry to go to work. You can't just add an additive and call it a day.
Yeah. Yeah, but I do like adding the additives too, because I think there is something to be said about hitting like a pH window that you're looking for, or actually this is a good transition to talk about some of the cool things that Creature Comforts was doing that Daniel was talking about, and one of those that kind of blew me away is like, oh man, that seems like a really smart idea, and I really want to try this. Maybe I'll do it as an experiment, pre-acidifying the wort before souring. So, your wort after the mash is going to be somewhere between 5.2 and 5.6 generally. And so what they're doing is actually pre-acidifying. They're adding lactic acid to the wort before they pitch any of their lactic acid bacteria. Oh, back up. Let me make sure everybody's on the same page about kettle souring, right? And what we mean by kettle souring. So kettle souring is you do your mash just like you would do a normal mash. You run off your wort into a kettle or some other container, and that's when you pitch in your either your lab culture, or you let whatever is on the grains sour for, let's say 18, 24 hours, something like that, until you reach kind of a target pH, which is somewhere around 3.5 or 3.6, something like that. You can go lower if you want to, but somewhere around that range. And this is why it's called a kettle sour, because it happens all on the hot side. So then once you've got your sour beer, you run that over into your kettle, boil it, add your hops, and you now have a sterile wort coming out of the brew house or out of your kettle going into your fermenters. So unlike if you're pitching something in your fermentation, that lactobacillus is in your fermenter. And if you put another beer on top of that without cleaning it all out or sterilizing it, or sanitizing it, you could have lactic acid carryover. That's my understanding, at least, of kettle sours. Anything to add there? That's kind of a brief rundown, Jordan.
I think the key here is that we're holding it at like 100 degrees Fahrenheit or so. We're pitching lactobacillus or using the natural lacto that's on the grains, and it's unhopped because most lactose strains are hop intolerant and will not properly acidify the wort in the presence of hops. And like Cade was saying, this is all before fermentation occurs. And since it's hop intolerant, it's also before the boil or the hopping occurs. And so I think kettle sours are kind of the colloquial name that we use at this point. There are home brewers and pro brewers that don't even technically do it in the kettle anymore. But I think that just generally speaking, kettle sour can be a good catch-all for pre-boil or pre-fermentation hot acidification via lacto. And actually, there is a bootleg biology pedio strain that can do it as well, sour weapon P. But almost always we're talking about a lactobacillus acidification process here.
Yeah. Generally, always lactobacillus. So hence the name, right? Lactobacillus lactic acid, right? I mean, that's kind of what that bacteria, when it was first discovered, was known for, was producing lactic acid. Now it's an entire genus of bacteria. And so, yeah, that's what we're talking about. Some sort of lactic acid fermentation that occurs before boil and before adding hops. Great note about the hops because that's super important. Some lactobacillus are often hop intolerant. And one thing, too, that lactobacillus are often intolerant to is oxygen. Very, very many strains of lactobacillus do not do well in aerobic fermentations, right? They do much better without oxygen present. And so that was another cool thing that Creature Comforts' process was doing. They're actually trying to transfer all of their wort around under a CO2 blanket or with CO2 and not with just air or pumps, so they're not like, for example, what most brewers would probably do is transfer their wort after the mash into their kettle and then pitch their lactic acid bacteria and just leave the kettle either, closed with the lid on top or something like that. But it just has all the air in the headspace there. So it's just going to ferment with whatever air is coming into and out of the kettle. But Creature Comforts is actually running CO2 into their kettle whenever they're souring. So they're actually covering the entire kettle with CO2 so that there's no oxygen in there. They're pushing through their heat exchanger with CO2. They're super controlled of this, and they found that it really impacts the souring process because the lactobacillus just don't perform well in the presence of oxygen. I don't know about you, Jordan, but I thought that was really cool and something might be a little difficult to do at the homebrew scale, but certainly if you've got the ability at the commercial scale, something that might improve your sours.
I found this absolutely fascinating because there is a long-running kind of sour beer lore that you must mitigate oxygen exposure during the lacto phase. And I believe it's probably the industry standard that people are blanketing with CO2. Some are even bubbling CO2 the whole time, or and the home brewers will put saran wrap or something on the top just to mitigate oxygen exposure. So it's pretty common. And there's a really good way that homebrewers can do it that I'll talk about in a second. But the concern has always been that we're going to make a gross sour beer. And the thought being is that something is happening during the oxygen exposure that's creating gross flavors. And now I'm kind of wondering if it's not so much that the lactic acid is producing off flavors or the lactobacillus is producing off flavors during an aerobic acidification phase. But what if, in fact, it's basically infection, that other things are taking hold in that aerobic environment while the lactic acid is being held back, or the lactobacillus is being held back in lactic acid production because of the presence of oxygen. So I found that was really a really fascinating finding.
Yeah, it could be. It certainly could be that there are other things that are taking hold. I mean, they're also, I again, not a microbiologist here, but if I remember correctly, I do think that there are some ways that oxygen's actually toxic to the lactose. So it might just not be, it might be under stressful conditions in the presence of oxygen. So just like yeast, when yeast is under stress conditions, it's going to pump out a whole bunch of things, that maybe don't improve the flavor of the beer because it's got to survive, right? It's just trying to survive. It's trying to deal with, for example, an acidic environment. It's going to produce a lot more things to regulate its internal pH so that it can survive in those environments. So yeah, maybe it is another microbe that's taking control. Maybe it is actually just that the lactobacillus is in a hostile environment in the presence of oxygen, or maybe some combination of both that's resulting in this. So I thought that was really cool. And if you can do that with the CO2 blanket, that's awesome. And certainly something that you should achieve. You did mention there might be a way for homebrewers to achieve a CO2 blanket.
Yeah, and before I say it, I'll also say that I think this is strain specific. So double check the Milk the Funk wiki when looking at your specific lactose strains. They might have information on its aerobic versus anaerobic properties, as well as its level of hop tolerance, and I think also whether it's heterorative or homofermentative, whether or not you would expect a little bit of fermentation from the lacto. If it's a lactose strain that's not supposed to ferment, and you after your your souring phase you observed attenuation, you had a contamination. And hopefully that's just the Chico that's floating around in your brew house, but that's not the intention here. But for home brewers that want to do this, if you're kegging your beer, you have everything you need. So you do your mash, and then you just run off into your keg. There's a recent short and shoddy that I published where I use this method, a smoothie sour, my first attempt at that kind of kettle sour style. So people can check out that article to see this process. But what I learned is running off hot into the keg, it takes a really long time to get down to 100 Fahrenheit when you're coming from like 150 Fahrenheit. So go ahead and use your chiller to run off at 100. It's just going to make your life a lot easier. Otherwise, you're going to be, adding your lacto 12 hours later or the next day or something. But yeah, so then you just, you're in a keg at 100F, you pitch your lacto and you put CO2, you close it and you fill it to like basically the brim and just leave CO2 5 PSI or whatever during the souring phase on your keg. And you can use a heat wrap, like the seed mats or whatever mats that they sell at More Beer, etc. You can use an electric blanket, and just that keg is a perfect vessel, and it's stainless steel, right? And you can pressurize it. You can use CO2 to push it out of the keg into your kettle when you're ready to boil it. Once it's hit your target pH, you can use a little picnic tap to take samples and monitor pH as you go without introducing any oxygen by opening it up. It's a really great vessel. And then, in my experience, all you need to do is PBW soak it and star san it. I'm not having infections of IPAs, etc., in these kegs that I'm kettle souring in occasionally because these strains are hop intolerant. And so a proper cleaning regimen and then following it with a beer that has hops in it, it's going to be fine. And it's a really good vessel for oxygen free or very low oxygen kettle souring at home.
That's a great idea. I love that idea of, fermenting or doing your lactic acid fermentation in a keg. That's really smart and really cool to think about doing. I might have to try that next time I do it because I've definitely got some like electric blankets around, and that way I'm not taking up space in my like kettle or my mash tun. I can just run it over into the keg and let it acidify. I love that too because you can take pH measurements as you're going along, and I wonder if the pressure helps a little bit too, right? Like just 5 psi of pressure just helps a little bit to make the fermentation move along. And I didn't want to forget, we kind of got totally off on this tangent about oxygen control and CO2 blanket, but we were originally talking about pre-acidifying the wort, and one of the reasons why Creature Comforts does that is by pre-acidifying the wort, that's less I think, that your lactic acid bacteria has to produce, or at least that makes sense to me, right? Their target pH that Creature Comforts is trying to hit is 3.45. So if you've already, given them a 4.7 wort instead of a 5.2 or 5.6 wort, then the lactobacillus is already sort of in its environment that it kind of likes to be in. And it can start its fermentation maybe quicker and do a better job of getting down to that 3.4, 3.5. And the other thing I like about the keg too is you can cut it off, right? At any point. You can just say, okay, done. Cut this off, run it over into my kettle, boil, and then I'm finished, right? I've got my souring as much as I want. But I wanted to talk a little bit about that pre-acidifying to pH 4.7. I wanted to get your thoughts on that, Jordan.
Yeah, this is a really great best practice when making kettle soured beers. You also will hear of people doing it with spontaneous fermentation. I don't think it's necessary with a lab culture based sour beer that you've already boiled and lightly hopped. With a traditional long-term sour beer, we're often adding 5 IBUs, etc. Not wanting too much because a lot of lactose strains are hop intolerant, but the PDO, etc., it's able to kind of handle a few IBUs. And so the fermentation is kicking in via the Saccharomyces, and there's really not a lot of concern. It's this window of time in which Saccharomyces-based fermentation is not happening is a danger zone. And so the reason that some lambic brewers and many kettle sour brewers are lowering the pH to 4.7, 4.5, etc., is you're reducing the pH outside of that external exogenous infection danger zone. It could be possible that something could take hold and start ripping through the beer before the lactobacillus has effectively taken hold, and you could get, even run the risk of botulism or something like that. And so it's a really important QA/QC mechanism, but a safety measure as well. And I can't help but wonder, like you said at the top, maybe there's some sort of just time benefit as well, skipping some of the acidification so we can just get straight to work at a pH of like, a little, just has less to do.
Yeah. Less to do. And again, like you said, that's a great point. And another thing that Creature Comfort does to make sure that they're, sort of eliminating any unwanted bacteria or microbes is they actually boil their wort for 10 minutes before they pitch their lactose strain. So they pre-acidify the wort, send it over to the kettle, boil it for 10 minutes, and then run it back into, I think it was the louder ton, but they might be lactic acid fermentation in the kettling. But anyway, boil it for 10 minutes, and that's to just kill anything that may be present in the mash itself, right? Because there are a whole bunch of microbes on the grains, and that's actually one of my favorite ways to make a sour beer is just let the microbes that are present on the grains do the souring for you. I think that's a really cool way to get a nice complex beer, and nothing funky so far every time that I've tried to do it. But they boil it, like I said, for 10 minutes. The other thing that they do, I think most commonly, like you said, Jordan, the temperature for souring in a kettle sour is around 100 Fahrenheit, maybe 105. But when I talked to Jeff Young at Blue Owl about this on the podcast, he said they're up around 115, 112, 115 when they're souring. And Creature Comforts is also up that high too. So I'm wondering, of course, again, strain dependent on lactobacillus. There are going to be some strains that do not survive at 115, but some of the strains that they like, that Blue Owl likes, and obviously the strain that Creature Comforts is working with, seems to like that higher temperature, that 115 Fahrenheit temperature. That's also going to kill off a whole bunch of things because they just can't survive at 115. I mean, that's pretty hot, for microbes, for living organisms. 115 is pretty hot. So that's another piece of this that's also helping, maybe the fermentation to go a little quicker, but also making sure that nothing else is getting in there. And the biggest takeaway from all of this, from Creature Comforts, is doing these things by controlling your oxygen, by pre-acidifying to 4.7, by fermenting at 115 Fahrenheit. They get their souring process in a total of 2.5 to 4 hours. My mind was blown when I heard that. I've never made a sour beer in less than 12 hours. I don't know. Have you, Jordan?
No. Yeah, this is absolutely bonkers, and clearly they have a truly magical strain, and I'm guessing they're not sharing it with other breweries or labs to sell to everyone else. And it's really their house character, and it's really beautiful. They've been repitching it for years, and clearly have discovered a truly magical lactose strain that's able to just finish the job before you've, cleaned out the mash tun or whatever.
Yeah, I mean, that's an interesting point too. Serially repitching. I mean, he described their serial repitching, process. They're just taking, they pitch their culture, or really, they just have a keg, right? It's a keg of wort that has live lactobacillus in it. And then once the wort has been boiled and it's ready to be inoculated, they just run that keg of wort into the kettle, and then they take out a keg before they boil it, right? And add hops. So they've just got this keg of lactobacillus that's been going and going and going for 9 years. And I think that's really cool. Obviously, they're brewing a lot of sours. I mean, I think he said that they're brewing every Monday a new batch of Athena, right? So they're generally have their entire brew house nice, spick and span and clean on Monday because of some of the other things like iron accumulation, some of the other issues that they were talking about, and hop residue, right? Hop residue was a big deal. I want to get to those after the break. But they had these things, and that's pretty cool that they just keep pitching this beer. So like once a week for the past 9 years, they've been putting the same lacto in there. Now, he said it's not the same lacto strain that they started with, which I think is also interesting, but they like what they have now. And obviously, I mean, I had some of those Athenas and they're fantastic. So it certainly seems to be working for Creature Comforts, right, Jordan?
Clearly so. If you ever get a chance to try it, it is one of the best kettle sour examples in this country.
Yeah. If you can find it, I highly encourage you to get it, especially if you're east of the Mississippi. I think you're going to be able to find it in a lot of places, but if not, certainly take a trip down there. Creature Comforts, I hear, is a great brewery to visit too. I hear they have a really, really great place. And also Athens, Georgia, catch a football game while you're there. All right, we're going to take a quick break, and then when we come back, we're going to talk about some tips and tricks, both hot side and cold side, that Jordan and I have in our experiences with kettle souring. So we'll be right back. The new Brewbuilt X2 Unitank conical fermenter is here, and it's ready to take your brewing game to the next level. With the best interior finish, welded and polished ferrules, clear bottom chamber, pressurizable with body connect fittings, etc., Brewbuilt has managed to bring commercial-level features into the homebrewing world at an unbeatable price. Now available with a professional-grade glycol jacket, giving you a more sanitary environment and much greater cooling efficiency, say goodbye to clunky immersion coils with the game-changing jacketed X2. Visit morebeer.com to learn more. Hundreds of years ago, it was very likely that all but the freshest beers had some form of lactobacillus, ultimately causing them to sour. But as brewing techniques advanced, brewers started adding hops, and we started to understand more about the microbes that impact beer and how to control them. We moved toward more modern practices of controlled souring. Today, in my opinion, it's as much an art to achieve a balance of sourness as it is hoppy and maltiness. And again, I'm a big fan of sourness, but like I said, that balance is hard to achieve. Don't you think, Jordan?
Oh my gosh, it's so important. There is nothing worse than a overly sour beer. I had a strawberry kettle sour last night that was so abrasively sour, I could not handle it. But the non-brewer people that I was with, they loved it. And so it really is a matter of preference. And me personally, I like a little bit more balanced. I'm more into like that, like the Creature Comforts, more like closer to 3.5 than 3.0.
Yeah, right. I'm not a big fan of the big enamel peelers. And I think that's one of the reasons why, I don't know, I like Belgian gooses and lambics. Don't get me wrong, I can appreciate some of those beers, but man, some of those I've had are like, whoa, like I just feel like I lost all the enamel on my teeth and now I can't really taste anything anymore, and I'm going to be tasting like Sour Patch Kids for the rest of the day. But different people have different tolerance for things, and again, achieving that balance is really important, especially like the spritz of lemon, the spritz of tartness really helps. And so on this in this half of the show, I wanted to talk about like some of the tips and tricks that you and I have had whenever we've done some kettle souring and incorporating some of Creature Comforts along the way. Before we took a break, we talked briefly about hops and the reason why Creature Comforts cleans their entire brew house so thoroughly of any beer that has hops in it that they're going to run the lactobacillus strains through. And they were saying like their heat exchanger, right? Running it through the heat exchanger to cool it, to cool the wort from like or whatever, to cool the wort down. If it had hops in it, it's peeling out a lot of that sour culture. And so they've at their new brew house, they have two separate sets of equipment: a heat exchanger that's used for hoppy beers and a heat exchanger that's not used for hop, that's used for just Athena for the sour beers. I thought that was really interesting. I personally don't take those kinds of controls with my process, but I'm wondering if I should.
I thought it was fascinating. And like you said in that episode, that most brewers are focused on making sure that their sour beer production doesn't contaminate their clean beer production. Yeah. And they're worried about the exact opposite, that their clean beer production could provide hops that effectively contaminate the sour beer production, thereby mitigating the lactic acid production.
Yeah. I mean, it's just so crazy to think about that. Like, and I remember thinking, like, no, it's not all that crazy as I think about it. But I'm like I said, I'm used to, worried about infection from lactobacillus. I'm not worried about the other way. But that, along with the concerns that they had about iron accumulation and how iron, being picked up throughout the process and through the yeast themselves while they're happening during fermentation, are causing all these issues. So there's a lot of little things that Creature Comforts has dug into to make Athena this amazing beer. So, all right, hot side tips and tricks. Let's start there. And the first thing I wanted to ask you, Jordan, is what lactoculture do you generally use? I mean, I know you talked about sometimes pitching lab cultures, but what do you use whenever you're souring beer?
Well, if I'm doing a kettle sour, I would just use Good Belly because it works really well. It's at the grocery store. I recently used Imperial's Lacto Brevis, and it was a really kind of slow acidifier, and it didn't go that low. But once I added some fruit puree, I was right on the money. So, it's not that it's bad. It's just different. And so it's all about having a total vision, right? And if you're expecting additional pH reduction from your fruit addition, if you're going to do a fruited kettle sour, this was a passion fruit mango kettle sour. This is the smoothie sour article I mentioned earlier. Passion fruit is notoriously low in pH and will really drive your pH down. I actually made a wit beer that I added passion fruit to and entered into a competition. Truly a clean beer. No acidification whatsoever. They said this is a sour beer. Should have entered it in the sour beer category, just from the pH reduction associated with the passion fruit puree addition. And so I think that it's all about having this total vision and picking the lactose strain that's really going to get you where you need to go, given the final end product and whatever additional variables and additions you're going to add. So, but I've had great success with other lacto blends. Omega has a really good one, I believe, like all the lactose or something, and it's several different ones, and that one works really well. So I think there's a lot to choose, but I think that a lot of homebrewers are just going to the grocery store and reaching for the Good Belly.
Yeah, I've definitely had success with Good Belly as well. But I think for me, whenever I'm deciding on what lactose strain that I want to use, it's exactly what you just mentioned. It's where am I going? Like what am I trying to get to? And how quickly am I trying to get to it? And for the most part, it's like, where do I want my ending pH to be, right? Am I going to add fruit to this, like you said? Am I going to add passion fruit? Or am I just making a nice tart kettle sour with no fruit additions like Athena, or and so that's where I want to know, like, okay, what lactose strain is going to get me down to this target pH? Like you, I felt like Lacto Brevis was a little bit slow, and actually for me ended up finishing at like 3.6 or 3.7, which was still sour, right? But not as sour as I wanted to get. Or no, I take that back. Actually, I think it finished over 4 at like 4.1 or 4.2, if I'm correct. And then I had to deal with some of the issues there of just kind of having a lightly tart but not really tart tart
beer.
That's
just a normal beer at that point.
Exactly.
A Saison could be 4.0 pH without any sort of acidification.
Totally. Yeah, exactly. But Good Belly is one I've had a lot of success with. And I know people think this is a risk. I haven't been burned by it yet. And so maybe that's why I'll keep doing it. But it's using the lacto that's present on the grains. I really like doing that, where you just mash at your normal temperature, right? 140, 150, and then rack that wort off into your kettle and don't do anything. Just leave it at 105 under, I don't even put saran wrap on top of it. And the times that I've done it, I just put the lid of my kettle on top and let it sit for like 24 hours. And that thing gets down to like 3.7 or 3.8 right before, right around the time that I'm ready to go and boil my beer. And then fermentation takes it down right around to like 3.5 or 3.6. It doesn't take it down a whole lot, but drops it just a little bit during fermentation. So that's kind of what I do. I really like using the whatever's present on the grains. But again, some people have been burned by it. I've heard a lot of anecdotes out there about people that end up making like gym sock beer or like stinky gross beers with that. And the other thing I will modify is the temperature. So I'm usually around 105, 110, or I might start going up as high as 115, since that's what Jeff Young at Blue Owl's doing, and that's what they're doing over at Creature Comforts. I might start pushing that up just to get a little bit of sourness. But there's a couple things there also that I kind of blew past, but that were important to Creature Comforts. Remember, Creature Comforts says they're doing their temperature at 115. I'm curious what you do on temperature. But then also, they're souring for 2.5 to 4 hours. I have never made a sour beer less than like 12 hours, and that was like the fastest that I can think of. I'm way more often at a full 24 hours, or maybe even longer. I mean, I've been up as much as I've never pushed one 2 days. I've never pushed one 48 hours, but I have been like between 24 to 36 hours. And that was one of those points where it was like, I brewed the day before it around lunchtime, and I come back the next day at lunch and it's still not sour. And like sometime by the evening, I'm like, I'm not letting this thing sit out anymore. I'm just going to go ahead and boil wherever we're at. So I've had some, what I would call not great successes at those longer time frames, but 2.5 to 4 hours. I just still can't get over the fact that they're doing it in that time frame.
No, yeah. I mean, I think that the times I've done Good Belly, and I was doing it a lot in like 2016, and I'm just not making kettle sours that frequently these days. But I think 48 hours was about what I would do. And I remember like always being freaked out, like, checking in the morning of like, crap, I gotta go to work. Now it's too sour. I don't want to get any more sour. And so you gotta maybe do it on a Friday night so you have the weekend to deal with it if you're working Monday through Friday. But Yeah, the Good Belly works, but not in 2 hours. And this Lacto Brevis from Imperial, at day 4, I called it, and it was
wow, you went that long. You went all the way to day 4.
Yeah, and I think that it got down to 4 pH, kind of like you. But luckily, the fermentation reduced the pH even more. And then the passion fruit puree reduced it to right where I wanted it. So it all actually worked out. But yeah, 2 to 4 hours, that is lightning fast.
Yeah. So I'm going to definitely try pre-acidifying my wort on the hot side and to see if that helps, to help these lactic acid strains. And that makes me also wonder, too, maybe the Lacto Brevis strain that is susceptible to oxygen, right? Maybe I should be doing something like a CO2 blanket, like bubbling some CO2 up through the bottom of the fermenter, or at least running a hose over the top and just, lightly blanketing some CO2 at 1 PSI or something while I'm allowing this to ferment. Maybe those things would help on the hot side.
Yeah, and my pro brewer friend was making a kettle sour at the same time with the same exact strain, and his went down to 3.2 no problem. So it could also be a function of viability, vitality, freshness, pitch rate, etc. And I just pitched a straight pack, and so that is something to consider is lacto health. And that's probably relevant to its effectiveness in your solution. And Good Belly just seems to be a lot easier. Set it and forget it. It just works.
Yeah, set it and forget it, and it works. And there's another thing too about the hot side that I don't worry about at all, because if you're doing a kettle sour, one of the things I don't worry about is cleaning my equipment. Right, I don't have to worry about any sanitation or anything like that on the hot side. I can just boil my beer in the kettle, and everything is totally sanitized. Contrast that to something like cold side pitching. Pitching a culture, something like what you're doing, Jordan, which is pitching and fermenting in the keg. I'd be worried about contamination, unwanted microbes making it into other beers that I don't want to be sour. I have no concerns about that on the hot side if I sour wort before boiling, but it is something I might be concerned about on the cold side. I mean, I don't know. It makes me feel a little risky, Jordan, doing what you're doing in the kegs.
Yeah, but the thing about this is it's just lacto, which is super hop intolerant. So I think that the real concern is Brett or maybe pedio, right? And so if you're doing a mixed fermentation beer in a keg and then using it for your Pilsner, definitely clean it out. And I could see that could be the risk. And I think that that's really the concern with cold side equipment vinyl tubing and stuff like that, is that you could somehow infect a clean beer by transferring it around, etc. But I'm less concerned about a kettle sour because, these things can't handle hops. And so, a fermented beer that goes into the keg that's then stirred cold at 32 degrees Fahrenheit or whatever, what's actually going to happen, especially given that I'm doing proper PBW and Star San.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. I mean, that's true. That's a good point, right? And I guess that's a good segue into cold side tips and tricks. And one question that I have is, okay, if lacto is so worried about, hops, which it is, right? It's hop intolerant. When are you hopping your beers? Are you dry hopping sours at all?
Oh, great question. I love dry hop sours. I don't know if I've ever dry hopped a kettle sour. No reason you couldn't. But it's actually kind of tricky. And so one time there was a Sour Hour episode on the Brewing Network where you could call in with questions, and they took one of my questions, which is, how does the Rare Barrel make dry hop sours? They make really good dry hop sours there, or they did. I guess that the Rare Barrel's kind of on its way out, which is unfortunate. But what they recommended is you actually dry hop clean beer really aggressively and blend that in with your sour beer, because people are reporting that dry hopping sour beer can create a dill pickle type flavor. Something about dry hopping super low pH beer, sour beer, it makes a pickle flavor. And so what they recommend is if you wanted to do 5 gallons at 1 ounce per gallon, you dry hop that net rate into a small amount of clean beer that you're going to blend in. So if you need, 1 part clean beer to 2 parts sour beer to make the pH blend that you're looking for, dry hop that 1 part of clean beer aggressively as if it was the entire 5-gallon batch, then blend that into with your sour beer on your way to package, and you can get a really beautiful expression in the sour beer while avoiding the dill pickle flavor.
Oh, that's interesting. I've never experienced that dill pickle flavor. I've dry hopped a lot of sour beers, and I've never experienced the dill pickle. I honestly, in a kettle sour, I dry hop exactly like I would in a normal beer, right? I just throw it right in. It is gonna, like, there is sourness, right? That's gonna compete with it, and you don't want to do, like, you don't want to make it like, too, I don't know, herbal or grassy flavor, right? You don't want that to happen. But I haven't noticed it extracting any like crazy flavors or anything like that. I mean, it's just kind of like anything else. You just have to have a deft hand and make sure that it's balanced, right? That the amount of hops that you're adding is balanced. I mean, I've made dry hopped IPAs. I've made lightly dry hopped beers. I've also added fruits and stuff, which we'll get to in just a minute. But I don't really have any concerns on kettle sours. I would, obviously, if you're doing a secondary fermentation, right? If you've pitched your mixed culture and, you've only fermented for a few days and you want to add your dry hops in, your dry hops are going to make that souring very difficult. It might still happen, right? There might still be some microbes in there that would survive the dry hop, but it's going to make it much more difficult. So just be aware of that. But I don't really have any worries about dry hopping kettle sours. And there was one other thing that Daniel mentioned that Creature Comforts does that I was like, oh man, I wish I could do this better or more often. I don't have a way to do it in my homebrew system, but it's that aggressive yeast dumping, because of the iron accumulation, right? He was saying that, like, yeast, basically, as soon as you pitch the yeast into fermentation, it sucks up all of the iron. And then as it dies or as it stops fermenting, it releases all that iron back into the beer. And that causes a metallic flavor in sour beers. Now, that I have tasted before, this metallic flavor in sours. And it's interesting because I was like, oh, that makes a lot of sense that we suddenly, like, release all this iron back into the beer. So he's aggressively there. Or not him specifically, but Creature Comforts is aggressively dumping their yeast out of the bottom of their fermenters. I thought that was cool.
Yeah, and I've heard this before with non-sour beer production, brewers that are professional brewers that are dumping the cone during active fermentation. And to me, that always felt like counterintuitive, right? Like, we want the yeast to ferment the beer. Why would we remove it? So you having way more commercial experience than I, have you heard much about this even in clean scenarios? Like, why is it okay to dump yeast during active fermentation if we're concerned about pitch rate?
Well, there's two things here, right? If you're not talking about sour beers, right? If you're talking about just normal beers, you're probably not going to dump your cone during normal fermentation because you want to harvest that yeast, right? You want healthy yeast that's down there that you can harvest and repitch into a successive batch. But there is a lot that has to do with dumping the cone aggressively. And there's a whole bunch of reasons, right? But haze can be one of them, like to let the beer like clear out, like, so that you're getting rid of material just down at the bottom. There's also a very physical thing that can happen when you chill the beer. In some yeast strains, that yeast can get really chunky at the bottom of the fermenter, and it makes it really hard to clean the fermenter, which is a very practical aspect. But again, this comes with a huge caveat too, because at Blue Owl, we didn't save any of the yeast. We didn't repitch. And so much like what Daniel was saying from Creature Comforts, they're using their regular IPA yeast that they're putting, they might have fermented a beer, an IPA, and then harvest that yeast from their IPA. They're going into Athena and then they're dumping that yeast. It's not getting reused or reharvested. It's just going straight down the drain. And so for them, it's no big loss, right? To dump that yeast down the drain. They're not repitching it. So I think that makes a lot of sense in ways of, in terms of what flavors and stuff you're losing. I would also say too, with other brewers, I think there's a lot of concern about, just reduced yield in your beer, right? If you're just dumping all this, because that's going to be liquid slurry. It's not going to have like settled and, become a nice, like dense, cone at the bottom. That's still going to be like liquidy and beery when it comes out. But to me, that was really fascinating. The other one thing that was cold side that Creature Comforts talked about was high ABV sours. I thought for sure that was just going to stress the yeast, right? Like yeast doesn't like being in sour beers in the first place, right? It likes being up around, between 4.2 and 5.2. That's where it likes to operate. But then you put it in something that's at like 3, 4, 5, I think is what Daniel was saying that they do for Creature Comforts. And then you add make the yeast essentially kill itself by producing a huge amount of ethanol. And I thought for sure you'd have some off flavors there, but no. He said Creature Comforts makes high ABV sours all the time, which I was really surprised about.
Yeah, and there's a couple tricks there to ensure that you get appropriate attenuation and good flavor production without any off flavors. Is they recommend frequently when making a kettle sour to actually use more of like a lager pitch rate, because the acidic environment is not very hospitable to brewer's yeast, and so by having a lager pitch rate, you have enough in there to effectively get the job done without struggling too much. And so I think that with a high ABV sour, you'd really want to start looking at lager pitch rates when doing that. One thing that's really problematic for bottle packaging of traditional long-term mixed fermentation sours is yeast shock, and they don't carbonate effectively, because when you blend in your sugar, the yeast is just dead and dormant, or you even pitch new yeast and it's just basically killed by the low pH, and so you don't get that re-fermentation in the bottom, you don't get any carbonation. And so also, I don't know if this is pioneered by the Rare Barrel or not, but I definitely learned from them, is what they call the yeast acid shock starter. And so what they do is blend like 1 part like 2 Play-Doh sugar water to like 1 part sour beer, and you pitch your fresh bottle conditioning yeast into that, and then you the next day you then pitch that solution into your sour beer, like your bottling bucket or whatever, because it's been 50% of the way down in terms of the acidic environment, and it's been acclimated to that. So one can't help but wonder if we could combine these two pieces of advice, the acid shock starter for bottling and a lager pitch rate for kettle sours, and combine the two and make your starter in a slightly acidic environment to start to acclimate it for a high ABV sour fermentation. And my thought is, why not just use a little lactic acid? Lower the pH to like 4 or 3.7 or something, or 3.8, something that's above the environment in which it's going to be pitched, but below standard wort pH, and just get it a little acclimated to a lower pH environment if you're going to be going into a high ABV and high acid environment.
Right. I mean, Creature Comforts is already saying like that they're pre-acidifying their wort before kettle souring. This seems like a great thing, right? If you're going to pitch on the cold side, pre-acidify your wort, right? And make your starter. Like, give it a little bit of opportunity to like adjust to the acidic environment. That may be a great idea. I mean, I might even go to like something like 4.7 or 4.5 or something, like Creature Comforts was doing. Maybe not as low as 4, and see how that works. That certainly sounds like something that would be interesting. Maybe a good idea for a future experiment for souring. I've already got several ideas, right? I mean, I've already got like CO2 blanketing. You've already got, pre-acidifying your wort to see if that helps with like lowering or reducing your souring time. You've got some aggressive yeast dumping to see if that changes any metallic flavors. I mean, all these kinds of experiments, and so cool to hear them iterating. Now, there were 2 other topics that we did just mention briefly in the episode with Daniel, and I wanted to talk about them with you, Jordan, and I think we can do them together because this is a particular specialty of yours, and that's fruiting and blending. So I wanted you to talk about those 2 things. I don't have great experience blending. I do have some experience fruiting, but you are kind of the guru in that area.
So when it comes to fruiting, again, like we talked about earlier, is you need to have a vision in mind. And so you don't want your fruits to make your beer too sour. And so you got to account for that. So what I'll often do is, whether it be a kettle sour or a mixed fermentation sour, is target a higher pH than my end goal, with the assumption that the fruit is going to bring the acidity up or the pH down from the fruiting addition. You typically want to ferment out your beer before you add your fruit. I know there are examples of mid-fermentation fruit additions. There's some people that are adding fruit at like flame out or in the last 10 minutes of the boil. You certainly can do that, but you run the risk of volatilizing off some of those beautiful fruit characteristics. Now, in the context of a kettle sour, I can see the temptation because we're not looking for Brett character, etc. Me personally, I would rather run the risk of a little bit of wild character rather than, I think that's the lesser of two evils than volatilizing off some of the delicate fruit aromatics and flavors, or cooking them for that matter, via adding it to the boil. But that's certainly a viable method. I had a homebrew friend. He would add frozen fruit at flame out, and it would serve to both integrate the fruit character and also somewhat cool the beer down on the way to pitching temperature. So that's definitely, the consideration is when you add it. And for me personally, you are never going to get the same level of complexity from whole real fruit than you're going to get from a puree. A puree is super easy. It's at the store, and you can get varieties that you can't readily get at the grocery store in the state you live in, right? Like here in the Pacific Northwest, we're not growing mangoes. We're not growing passion fruit. And so the Oregon fruit puree, which is actually, I believe, packaged out near you in Salem, is a great opportunity to get some tropical fruit flavor into your beer. But what I would really recommend people do is rely on their local farmers markets and local fruit. And that's what's fun about sour beers. You can really kind of make it a regional delicacy. And whether you're doing a kettle sour or a mixed fermentation sour, real fruit is really the way to go, in my opinion. And it goes both ways. Purees can work well in both kettle sours and mixed fermentation sours. But that's one thing that I find often lacking in a kettle sour is complexity. And real fruit is a really good cheater way to create a lot of complexity without having to go the whole year in the blending and all that goes in with mixed fermentation approach.
Yeah, that's really good advice on fruiting. I mean, it's interesting. I love the idea of the local farmers market, just like seeing what kind of fruits you can get and doing that and whatever's like in season. But like you, Jordan, I often use purees. That was going to be one of my main comments is like the purees are so easy to use and they're so flexible. The other thing that purees help me with especially is minding the pH or the acidity, right? Where you're going. You mentioned that, and those are kind of the two things I think about with fruit. Well, three things. What flavor do I want, right? That's the biggest deal is like, what am I trying to go for? Do I want blueberry? Do I want, peach? Peach is one of those that's super hard for me to get if you use raw peaches, right? Like just like the peach fruit. But with purees, you can actually really dial up the peach character. Peach fruit, to me, anytime I've ever added peach fruit, I just end up adding like 5 gallons of peaches to a 5-gallon batch and then still just like not coming away with peach. That's an exaggeration. I'm not actually serious. I've never added 5 gallons of peach to a 5-gallon batch of beer.
I have.
But I mean, it's one of those flavors that doesn't work for me. But purees are a great way to monitor your acidity and also your fruit flavor. All right, blending. Last topic before we close the show.
Actually, if you don't mind, a quick note on fruiting that you've put in my mind is one, really, 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 really high fruit levels is my recommendation there. We want a fruit beer to taste like fruit. And like you said with peach, blueberry is another great example. If it's like a whisper of that, well, what's the point? Obviously, there's a time and place for that. If you want that, that's great. But if you want potent fruit character, you need to use a ton. Like basically 1-to-1 ratio. For every gallon volume that you're adding, you want a gallon volume of fruit. Milk the Funk is your friend. They have a type in Milk the Funk fruited sour. They have a big chart with recommended dosing rates. We're typically looking at 2 to 4 pounds per gallon of raw fruit in order to achieve that. And things like blueberries and peaches, you want to go as high as you possibly can. Your loss is going to be insane, but that's what it takes, and it's going to be very expensive. But there's a way to kind of combine things here. Things like peaches and blueberries, which are tough. You can do, your real fruit and add a can of puree, and it can kind of help boost, the best of both worlds. And if you're using the purees, I will really recommend, it's really expensive, 2 cans of Oregon fruit puree per 5 gallons. 1 can is pretty light in flavor. Honestly, 3 cans is probably even better, but that stuff is expensive. It's like $50 a can. So I understand the hesitation, but trust me, it's worth the coin. You want to go big on fruiting. So that's my last stand on fruiting. Okay, blending. I don't think for kettle sours it's that necessary, and that's one of the beauties of kettle sours, right? Is we're trying to dial in a product that's exactly at the spec we want it with one go. And so, once you've hit your desired pH for that point in the process, knowing that fruiting or fermentation is going to reduce the pH some, you boil it. and you stop the pH and you lock it in. With mixed fermentation sour, it is what it is. I've got 5 gallons of sour stock sitting behind me that's at 2.9. That means I need 3 gallons of clean beer for every 1 gallon of sour beer to hit like 3.2. I did the math with some pH adjustments or a pH meter and stuff. And so blending is clearly going to be really helpful when making mixed fermentation sour beer, because these cultures, they work too well. And it really, makes the beer too sour. Obviously, there's some other levers we can pull. I should have hopped my beer more when I boiled it, but I wasn't anticipating this aggressive of a pH reduction. Professional sour beer makers, that's all they do. They're really locked into the effectiveness of their culture, and they're constantly raising their IBUs to fight the acidification that's happening. So there are things you can do on the hot side there, but more frequently, you don't know until a year later. And so that's where blending comes in. And my recommendation is simply making a really, really dry, clean beer like Saison or something that's attenuating really low. And then you get your pH meter and you get some samples and you start measuring out the ratios that you need to get the pH you want. You're also paying attention to flavor, right? If you have a bunch of sour stock, it's like, wow, this one's really wood forward. This one's really funk forward. And you figure out your blends, use paper and pencil and droppers and pH meters, et cetera, to make sure that the gestalt, the cumulative flavor profile is well balanced. So, but this is something you could totally do on the Kettle Sour side as well. Maybe you went to work and it was 3.5 and you come home and it's 2.9. Blend a clean beer to rebalance that out. Or maybe there's some fruits that you could add that are actually going to raise the pH because they're a higher pH fruit and you're already too low. So it's not really the industry standard when it comes to Kettle soured beer, but it's certainly another tool in the toolbox, especially as kind of like a damage control scenario.
Yeah, it's for me, for kettle souring, that's one of the big pluses of kettle souring versus like letting something go in the fermenter and a secondary, is that you can stop it whenever you're ready, when you hit your pH, right? I mean, again, like, yeah, if you go to work, if it's at 3.5 in the morning and then you go to work and it's now at 2.9, right? I mean, obviously, that you're going to have to do something like Jordan said, blend some, non-sour beer back into it to raise that pH. But for the most part, right, if you're, watching it, once it hits 3.5, you throw it over into the kettle and boil it, and then it's done, right? There is no fermentation that's going to continue to happen because you've killed off all the yeast. You've sterilized the wort as part of the boil. So you don't have to worry about it getting any sour. You've hit that pH and it's there. Now, there will be a little bit of reduction during fermentation. That'll happen, right? But it's not going to be a whole lot. It's not going to drastically challenge or change the pH of your beer. So again, yeah, for me, exactly like you said, Jordan, blending, not a big deal for kettle sours. But if you are using traditional sours or traditional fermentation methods, take those methods into heart, like what Jordan just said. And you really do kind of have to become a mad scientist a little bit. Blend a little bit and see what it tastes like. Blend a little more, see what it tastes like. Iterate, go up, go down, see what pH tastes great with that fruit addition or whatever. And that is really kind of a fun part of blending. And I do want to do a show. Hopefully, maybe I can get Mike Tonsmeyer on to do a traditional American sour beer, and then we can do the applying the science, where we talk really dive into your blending process there with your traditional sours. But I think we nailed it or hit at least enough for kettle sours today. What do you think, Jordan?
Yeah, they're a really fun style, and it's a really good introduction. It's a long time between you're finally drinking your first mixed fermentation sour blend, and there are sour breweries that will open with kettle sours because they got to have something on tap. So give it a try, and you'll be drinking a thirst-quenching sour beer in just a couple weeks.
Yeah, exactly. The same amount of time that it would take you to produce a normal beer, right? You grained a glass in 2 to 3 weeks with a nice, refreshing sour beer using a kettle souring process. And take into mind some of the concepts that Creature Comforts is doing, like pre-acidifying your wort, minding your oxygen control, watching to make sure you don't have hop residues in your equipment or your wort chillers or anything like that. Aggressively dumping your yeast. All of these things. Use what this commercial brewer is doing. I mean, those things are applicable for brewers of any size, from home brewer all the way up to breweries like the size of Creature Comforts that are cranking out huge volumes of amazing kettle sour beer. So cool. I think there's a lot of really useful tips and tricks. And I think I finished. Anything else you want to add, Jordan?
Actually, this is a really good thing for a beginning brewer, too. I had a coworker that wanted to brew a beer, and I helped him make a kettle sour. And, the acidity, it can kind of cover up some of the flaws that could be associated with a sack-only fermentation. Use Kveik, and something that's really foolproof. And it's really a lot easier than you think, and it can even be a wonderful first beer to ever brew.
Yeah, that's totally true. Maybe it takes a little bit longer in terms of, the day of brewing, right? You got to let it sour. But yeah, it's a great style for beginners who are interested in increasing that sourness. So check out the tips and tricks that we gave you in this episode, and also listen to the episode with Daniel LePage from Creature Comforts where we talk about kettle souring. And Jordan and I will be back in 2 weeks with our next Applying the Science episode. See y'all then. The Brew Lab is a production of Brewlosophy, where they who drink beer think beer. Don't forget to visit brewlosophy.com to read about our weekly experiments and other brewing adventures, and listen to us talk about it on our other show, the Brewlosophy Podcast. Thanks to all of our sponsors and patrons that help make this show possible. If you'd like to receive a reward for helping us do what we do, visit patreon.com/brewlosophy to see how you can do just that. Thanks so much for listening. We'll be back in the Brew Lab with another guest next week. Until then, think beer.